Chapter 251, Fierce Battle 1. Several events took place simultaneously and very fast. At that, after regaining consciousness, Samael did not stop thinking while suffering from severe trauma. She grasped the situation by inferring from the new information obtained through the Mammon family what she knew already and what Abrasak said on the day she was attacked by other directors of the dungeon market. The battle among the 5 directors of the dungeon market was the beginning of the whole situation. The King of Pride made a bond with the King of Envy. Although there was a war going on in the northern area, it was only a deception after all. The majority of the King of Envy's forces were still unaware that their king was killed in action. The special auction house of the dungeon market, which was Samael's own dungeon, was already captured by the King of Pride. Even though the King of Pride did not absorb Samael's entire forces, it was largely irrelevant to him in the current situation. The territory Samael was in charge of was that of the King of Gluttony. The territories of the King of Envy and the Queen of Fury, who must be engaged in a fierce battle at the moment, were taken care of by Bifrons and Abrasax, respectively. The army of the King of Gluttony began invading the territory of the Queen of Fury. The Queen of Fury attacked the east, as she always did, but the dungeon market directors attacked all over the territory of the Queen of Fury, seizing the moment. Although the information Gardamundi obtained through her family's secret channel was very fragmentary, Samael, one of the 5 directors of the dungeon market, again inferred the situation this time. According to Samael's analysis, the dungeon market pulled the sword properly this time. It was impossible to capture all the dungeons in the territory of the Queen of Fury in just one day, even if the masters under the command of the King of Pride were not wary of it. Therefore, the most rational strategy that the King of Pride could take in the current situation was to choose his target and concentrate on it. It was evident that the King of Pride must have deployed most of his forces to some of the key points, including the Temple of the 8 Clans. The demon world was vast. It was not possible to find out all the situations in detail, even if the King of Pride dispatched scouts to the battle zones. The only information that he could get in real time was, at best, a military movement at the major crossroads. But it was almost impossible to find out in real time what was happening in the remote area. On the surface, the King of Pride and the King of Envy were still at war. Moreover, it took less than 3 days for all this to happen. During this period, the King of Pride privatized the dungeon market for the first time, so it was natural that the Queen of Fury was put on the defensive. Besides, the House of Mammon was located at the southern end. It took at least a few days for them to properly understand what was happening in the north. Without Citri and Samael, nobody might have known what was going on. Samael knew she had to stop the domino that started with the fall of the dungeon market. Above all, she had to stop the Queen of Fury from collapsing helplessly. The King of Greed, Samael, burst into laughter before she knew it. As one of the 5 directors of the dungeon market, she was confident that she could observe what was going on in the entire demon world, but she didn't realize there was someone who established himself as the king of the unclaimed land in the south. Besides, he had the 12 spirits of Mammon under his command. It was shocking that Citri was none other than the Queen of Sloth. She could not hold back the urge to laugh when she recalled her reporting at the dungeon market directors meeting that the Queen of Sloth was still in seclusion when she was Citri. I can stop it. I can protect it. The power of the King of Pride was terrifying. He overpowered the north and took over the dungeon market. But Yongho's forces were as powerful as them. They were never inferior to the king's forces. Samael closed her eyes. Recalling the faces of Carrot and other subordinate spirits, she clenched her teeth. The Temple of the 8 Clans was burning. Based on the information Gusion obtained through his powerful sensation, the enemies numbered more than 100. Moreover, about 20 to 30 of them had an unusually powerful energy. According to the dungeon market's criteria for determining its items, they were 5-star spirits. There was one fundamental reason why the Temple of the 8 Clans was forced to collapse helplessly. There was one entity that created the decisive power difference between the 2 sides. Gusion stopped gathering further information, then ordered his men around him. Ophelia, who was more quick-witted than anybody else, took action first. The previous masters of the House of Mammon led the arena spirits and started attacking the dungeon market spirits scattered throughout the Temple of the 8 Clans. Gardamundi, who was in charge of guiding them here from the door of space, flew desperately to search for her father Biryubakcha. When there was no one left behind, with Ophelia and Eligos leaving to join Yongho's forces, Gusion stepped forward slowly. The guy who was standing without moving several hundred meters away from Gusion also began to walk toward him. The surroundings were noisy. However, the two walking toward each other were silent. Gusion didn't say anything while his opponent Orobas trembled with joy. It didn't take long for both to stop walking on. They now faced each other about 10 meters away from each other. Orobas swallowed, looking at him. He looked at Gusion several times, who was standing close enough to talk to him, then suddenly burst into a big laughter. He was not sneering at Gusion. He made a hearty and delightful laugh. "Oh my God, this is that same guy. Yay, he is right. I saw this man, the strongest red demon I had seen in a video I accidentally obtained as a child," Gusion murmured. He was the same as the one in the video. In particular, the horns of the bull that grew above his head were exactly the same. "You must be Gusion with Herculean power, the strongest one of Mammon's 12 spirits, and my longtime target," Orobas said. Why did he appear here now? How could he still be alive like this? His desire to fight Gusion overwhelmed Orobas at the moment. He wanted to get those details out of his mind and fight him first. He wanted to prove his power. It would not be too late for him to hear the specific answers to such questions after defeating Gusion first. Orobas added mana to the 6 horns that he already released. By doing so, he brought out an enormous power that could not even be compared to when he slaughtered the representatives of the 8 clans. There was no more silence between them. The atmosphere screamed as if it was shocked, and the small and light things around it shook violently. It was as if the whole world was thrilled with Orobas' power. Orobas was now indulged in pleasure. He said with a smile on his face, "I'm the strongest power, Orobas. As you can see, I'm the strongest red demon ever. I want to prove it by defeating you today." He spoke as arrogantly as possible. His narcissistic eyes were already seeing a glorious victory. "Oh, you're the strongest." Gusion didn't say much. Instead of supporting his power with colorful words, he immediately opened up the 6 horns on his head. He didn't need to say anything when he was about to fight. "I'm going to kill you." Gusion hit the ground and disappeared from Orobas' vision. Aemon broke through the air. The green flames rising along the trajectory arose once again, engulfing the surrounding area. The King of Lust stepped back. He saw the green flames with an incredulous expression. His hands, holding the godly energy of lust, kept trembling. Obviously, it was the magic spear of the Red Lotus that the King of Greed Mammon used to hold. Obviously, it was the sin of greed had he returned, had he closed the celestial door, passed the 1,000 years, and finally appeared like this. The King of Greed, the King of Lust shouted once again, and Yongho penetrated through the green flames. Aemon's sharp spear was shot toward the heart of the King of Lust, but it missed its target. Just before it hit its target, Yongho twisted his arm. Aemon was shot in the air far from the original spot that he targeted, while the King of Lust stood fixated on the ground as if nailed down and looked at Yongho. "You are not Mammon," said the King of Lust. At the same time, Yongho stepped back, withdrawing Aemon. Although he tried to smash the king right away, he could not control his body for some reason. "You are not Mammon. It's greed, but not Mammon. You are not him," the King of Lust said again. He gradually stopped his hands from trembling. Aemon shouted in Yongho's head, "It is the power of lust that seduces even the enemy. Withdraw your subordinate spirits, only the Queen of Fury, and you must confront him." Now, the king's hands didn't tremble anymore. Furious anger was on his face when he was startled by the man standing before him. Yongho hit the ground. Once again, he activated the green flames and blocked the space between him and the King of Lust. Although he activated the flames to attack the king, he could not bring himself to kill the king. He was haunted by that thought. "Catalina, back off. Join Kaiwan and fight at the front line." Chapter 252. Fierce Battle 2. Yongho conveyed his strong message to her through Brigada. Catalina, who was trying to land on the ground along with Yongho, raised her altitude again, and Kaiwan, who was riding on Salamis' back, bit her lips and headed for the forces of the Queen of Fury. The same was true of Skull and Skathak on Bucephalus. Avoid him, the Queen of Fury suddenly shouted at Yong-ho. He hurriedly lowered his body, and the King of Lust's sword energy cut through over his head. The green flames activated by him also cracked and faded away. Awaken the power of godly energy. The only one who can confront a king with a godly energy is a king with a godly energy. Even before Aemon finished speaking, the King of Lust took action first. He rushed toward Yong-ho with a force that was several times more intense than when he charged at the Queen of Fury. The godly energy of Lust clashed with Aemon head-on. The godly energy of Mammon located on Yong-ho's left arm began to emit a luxurious light. Clenching his teeth, he looked at the King of Lust, then thought about it before he knew it. No, I don't want to harm the king. I would rather die if I have to harm him. His hand holding Aemon became so weak. The godly energy of the King of Lust didn't miss that moment. It was sliding on Aemon's spear. It then suddenly drew a strange trajectory. It flew like a flash toward Yong-ho's neck. "Master!" Aemon shouted. At the same time, lightning struck. Yong-ho came to his senses only after he was covered with the fragments of lightning. The Queen of Fury was in the spot where he bounced off. She kept the King of Lust in check by wielding an axe bigger than herself. The power of seduction was so strong, especially Yong-ho, who was the opposite sex from the viewpoint of the King of Lust, who changed his identity to a woman, found it hard to overcome the temptation. The Queen of Fury was not on par with the King of Lust in terms of strength. Unlike Yong-ho, who almost gave up, she didn't give up defending herself against the king. But she could not mount an attack properly because of the power of temptation. The white limbs were quickly stained with blood. Yong-ho clenched his teeth. He not only erected his 6 horns, but he also triggered the demon god's heart, then charged at the king at full speed. He stabbed the air right beside the king with Aemon, then made all of his available mana explode. The ground-shaking explosion affected both the King of Lust and the Queen of Fury. The King of Lust wielded the godly energy of lust to block the explosion and shockwaves, but the Queen of Fury bounced out, unable to defend herself properly. It was exactly what Yong-ho aimed for. Yong-ho hit the ground with Aemon, then injected the mana of greed into Aemon, also one of his subordinate spirits, so Aemon could fire up an intense flame that could not even be compared with any flame before. The green flames engulfed Yong-ho. The King of Lust retreated immediately, but Yong-ho threw himself toward the king, leaving Aemon alone. Then he snatched the king's waist in the air and brought out Catalina's mana through Brigada. He spread the wings of the shadow and soared. Skathak said the only king who could confront a king with a godly energy should also be equipped with a godly energy, which Aemon also confirmed. But Yong-ho's godly energy of Mammon was not complete yet, so he had to obtain the godly energy that could pair with the king's sin of lust in order to overcome his temptation. He could gain time only briefly by using the green flames of Aemon. Crossing over the forces of the King of Gluttony, he landed right on the ground. The Queen of Fury, who got out of Yong-ho's arms, stumbled. He grabbed her shoulders, covered with blood, and said urgently, "Please unbuckle your belt." The Queen looked at him blankly. Everything was confusing to her. Even in the midst of the fighting, her heart was beating like crazy. Is this man the King of Greed? Is the master of the House of Mammon really the King of Greed? Is it true that I was just held in the arms of the master of the Mammon family? Really? Why is he asking me to unbuckle my belt and in the middle of the battlefield at that? The Queen's face turned red. Only then did Yong-ho realize his mistake and take action instead of correcting himself. He pulled out the godly energy of fury he was wearing on his right arm and gave it to the Queen. He no longer concealed the godly energy of fury with the power of greed. He also did not hide the sin of gluttony. The Queen of Fury again had a blank expression on her. She instinctively understood it. The sin of fury roared fiercely in her heart. She hated the sins of greed and gluttony that appeared before her eyes. The Queen of Fury unbuckled the godly energy of gluttony. As soon as he saw it, Yong-ho said quickly, "Let's exchange what wedding gift?" This time Yong-ho was embarrassed. The Queen, Dhritarashtra, hurriedly presented the godly energy of gluttony. "Oh, it's nothing." He had no time. He wore the godly energy of gluttony around his waist, while the Queen of Fury put the godly energy of fury on her right arm. The green flames that had been moving under Ayamon's command finally faded away. The King of Lust began to rush to Yong-ho, breaking through the energy of gluttony. Yong-ho grabbed the air. After summoning Armin again, who had disappeared after turning into the flames of the Red Lotus, he stared at the King of Lust. The king grabbed his chest with his left hand as if suppressing his heart that was pounding. It was embarrassing that the master of the Mammon family had not only the sin of greed, but also the sin of gluttony, but he could not afford to think about it. The King of Lust swung the godly energy of lust violently, which sent off the giant energy of the sword to him and the queen, which seemed powerful enough to rip apart the world. Yong-ho concentrated. He didn't need anything like an explanation. The Queen of Fury also understood it by instinct. Gluttony and fury, the two sins that faced each other in 1,000 years, roared loudly and released the power of true sin. Gusion disappeared before his eyes. He was clearly in front of Orobas until a moment ago, but he suddenly disappeared. It wasn't magic, it was much simpler than that. Bang! When Orobas realized it, Gusion already appeared right in front of him. Orobas barely twisted his body and avoided his punch. Gusion punched the air with a big noise, and there was something like a knife cut left behind on the spot where he punched. Gusion and Orobas made eye contact with each other. Then they were engaged in fighting again. Gusion punched Orobas' upper body with his left fist, which made him hesitantly step back. Gusion once again disappeared from his eyes. He lowered his body and threw himself on the side of Orobas. Orobas gave up looking for him. At the same time, he released a lot of mana and triggered all his senses. In an instant, he could obtain information about Gusion's location and motion. He now could feel in real time how Gusion was moving in front of him. Orobas began to move himself to defend against Gusion's attack. He tried to shake his motion by releasing mana. Fully bang, Orobas' efforts were in vain. His release of magic did not shake Gusion. The moment Orobas thought he felt Gusion, Gusion was already done attacking him. A powerful impact several times as strong as the one earlier shook Orobas violently. Orobas felt like his body was shattering. He felt like the part of his body struck by Gusion was being ripped apart. But Orobas' body wasn't really broken. He endured it. The body of a red demon, possessing a powerful mana, was like steel that could never be broken. Orobas instinctively felt his opponent was strong. If he continued to let Gusion attack him, he would eventually collapse. He had to fight back. Orobas clenched his teeth and swallowed the pain. He felt it instead of seeing him. He clenched his right fist and concentrated all of his tremendous mana on one point. His opponent was obviously quick. However, even he had to stop for a moment. Orobas waited for that moment. Gusion punched Orobas' side again, but Orobas survived it again. This time, Orobas punched him without losing the crucial moment. When he rolled on the ground before punching Gusion, it was smashed violently. With such a gigantic force, Orobas threw his punch at Gusion, but there was no roaring sound, nor was the blunt sound of punching. It wasn't that Gusion escaped his attack. Orobas felt terrible. He was stunned at the fact that his attack was intercepted. He found that Gusion's left hand was blocking his punch. Even before Orobas managed to throw his punch, Gusion took preemptive action to stop it. Then Gusion pressed down on Orobas' terrifying power. Gusion wasn't just quick, but he was also really powerful. That was why he was called Gusion with Herculean power, the strongest physical force of Mammon's 12 spirits. Gusion looked at Orobas and made him realize what his strongest power meant. The sin of gluttony was like saying this: I want to eat him, I want to chew him, I want to swallow him. The godly energy of gluttony responded and let Yong-ho know how to do it. A huge energy of the sword released by the King of Lust was trying to engulf Yong-ho. Its sharpness seemed to cut the heaven and earth. He stretched out his left arm toward the sword energy. The godly energy of gluttony he was wearing on his waist guided him. A vortex of magic arose on his palm. It happened in an instant. Something black and huge swelled from the palm of Yong-ho's left hand. At once, it became several times larger than Yong-ho and opened its mouth. Then it ate all the energy of the sword instantly. Something black disappeared. Yong-ho blinked his eyes before he knew it, and he felt his stomach was full. Now he realized the sin of gluttony unwittingly. The sin of gluttony was basically a being that devoured everything before it. Bang! Chapter 253, Fierce Battle 3. The Queen of Fury hit the ground. A red aura rose from her whole body. Intense mana radiated from the godly energy of fury equipped on her right arm. It was really red lightning. Her fist, which was thrown like a thunder, hit the ground. The King of Lust tried to step back hurriedly, but it was hard because the ground about a dozen meters in diameter around her collapsed at once when she swung her fist. The power of fury was very simple. It was transcendental power that could even endure any Herculean power. A smile was on the face of the Queen of Fury. The constant rising power excited her. Stepping on the fragments of the crumbling ground, she soared and clenched her fist again. She looked at the King of Lust, who also soared like her, stepping on fragments as she did. The King of Lust, disguised as a woman, was still beautiful. He had an absolute beauty that even the Queen felt tempted to fall in love with as a woman. But that was all. The Queen could not hear the King's tempting voice anymore. It seemed she could destroy the King right now. The power of fury neutralized the power of lust. She didn't allow the King to confuse her. Yong-ho brought out Catalina's mana and soared into the sky after spreading the wings of shadow. He smashed the ground and flew toward the Queen of Fury, who was pursuing the King of Lust. The King of Lust quickly swung his sword. A number of sword energies created in an instant stretched toward the Queen of Fury. But the Queen did not block or avoid the sword energy. She rushed to the King, and Yong-ho caught up with the Queen, then devoured the sword energy with the power of gluttony. The Queen of Fury smiled. It was a smile as bright as the power of pure fury. Yong-ho passed her and swung Aemon to attack the King of Lust directly. Bang! Aemon and the godly energy of lust clashed head-on. Although his attack was blocked, Yong-ho looked at the King of Lust beyond the entangled Aemon and the godly energy of gluttony. The King of Lust also saw him and looked into his eyes as if tempting him. Are you going to harm me? Are you going to harass me? Are you really trying to kill me? Master, Aemon shouted loudly and created a fierce flame by himself. Yong-ho came to his senses suddenly and fidgeted with his fingers urgently to block the godly energy of lust from raining down on his head. Aemon said to Yong-ho quickly, "You are not yet unfamiliar with gluttony and the godly energy. Gluttony does not completely invalidate the power of lust, it's just neutralizing it. Sick, moreover, their match is not good. The power of your anguish is too strong." Hearing that, Yong-ho cursed it from the bottom of his heart. Yes, seriously. The 7 horns of light that sprouted on the head of the King of Lust vibrated, then released the unprecedented power of lust that was incomparable to its past power. Yong-ho again felt tempted by the beauty of the king. He seemed to yield to his absolute charm at any moment. Stick it out. Yong-ho clenched his teeth not to be tempted. Recalling Catalina and Kaiwan, he brought out the power of Brigada. He was engulfed by Catalina's justice that inherited the power of Elune, and Kaiwan's passion that inherited the power of Magnodon. They protected him from the fatal attack of temptation by the King of Lust. I am coming. The Queen of Fury intervened between Yong-ho and the King of Lust. Her relentless attack forced the King of Lust to step back again. After catching his breath, Yong-ho looked straight ahead and realized something new. The place of their fighting, which was taking place in the spot within the influence of the power of gluttony, was suddenly moved to the vicinity of the defense line of the 8 clans. The Queen of Fury attacked the King of Lust fiercely, but the king evaded all her attacks. The king even swung the godly energy of lust violently and forced the queen to move back for a while. He then unleashed all the power of lust that he had condensed. It was like a wave. The power of lust that was unleashed by the king charmed the remnants of the 8 clans. It captivated the hearts of everyone who was there, regardless of age or sex. Dozens of them changed the target of their attack to their master. Some of them rushed to the Queen of Fury that they had been following with respect, while others pierced their chests with their own weapons. A fountain of blood was gushing from everywhere. The Queen of Fury lost her mind momentarily, as if she had been hit in the head with a hammer. The Queen of Fury! Yong-ho shouted at her and hugged her from behind. Then he soared into the sky vertically with her to avoid the attack by the tribesmen of the 8 clans. But it was only the beginning. The tribesmen of the 8 clans who started attacking their queen committed suicide all at once, as if they admitted their own failures. The queen, who was held in Yongho's arms, wailed at the top of her lung. But the King of Lust did not stop. They kept committing suicide everywhere. The Queen of Fury's mana increased drastically. It was the attribute of fury that the more intense the owner of fury became, the more power he could bring out. Yongho could no longer hold the Queen of Fury. As soon as she wriggled herself out of his arms, the queen landed on the ground and charged toward the King of Lust ferociously. The ground collapsed in succession. Every time the Queen of Fury punched the king, it shook the ground. But the King of Lust easily evaded her attack. Basically, he was the sword demon, though he had the title of the King of Lust. In fact, he was called the best and strongest swordsman in the demon world. The queen's attack, which became so simple in proportion to her increased mana, could never harm the king. Yongho once again blocked Catalina and Kaiwan from approaching by communicating telepathically with them. He ordered them to stop running toward him. It wasn't just the problem of the tribesmen of the 8 clans who were killed, enchanted with the charm of the King of Lust. The queen's attack broke their defense line. The battle between the forces of the King of Gluttony and the 8 clans was still going on, although it was overshadowed by the fierce fighting between the King of Lust and the Queen of Fury. If this kind of fighting went on to the end, Yongho was supposed to be dealing with the corpses of the 8 clans piled up like a mountain once the battle was over. Yongho caught his breath. He had to end the fighting as soon as possible, even at the risk of consuming his power too much. He triggered the heart of the demon god. Its 6th claw penetrated Yongho's chest, and a 7th horn of light sprouted above his head. He focused on the godly energy of gluttony. Then he threw himself toward the Queen of Fury and the King of Lust, triggering the power of gluttony again, and devoured the mana of lust released by the King of Lust. The King of Lust's mana that filled the surroundings disappeared completely. The momentary void of mana created a new distortion. The tribesmen of the 8 clans who were dominated by the King of Lust lost consciousness and fell on the floor. It was never easy for Yongho's godly energy of gluttony to eat away the mana of lust that contained a powerful temptation. Moreover, since the target wasn't as clear as to when he first devoured the sword energy, Yongho had to even devour the mana of fury that had been in full swing. 2 different mana were raging inside him as if they would explode anytime soon, so he managed to suppress the explosion by pouring his own mana. It wasn't just gluttony and fury that neutralized the power of lust. The power of lust also neutralized the power of gluttony, which required more consumption of mana for that reason. However, the void of the mana on the part of the King of Lust was definitely effective. The Queen of Fury, who paused her attack for a moment, rushed back to the King of Lust, who stumbled because of a sudden loss of mana. At that moment, Yongho grabbed Ammon and moved to help the Queen. For the first time since dealing with the King of Lust, he had demonstrated his full power without any hindrance. Yongho and the King of Fury worked together perfectly to attack the king, as if they agreed in advance for a long time. The Queen, who restored reason while losing some of her terrifying mana, took the lead, while Yongho assisted her in attacking the king hard. Although the king was the finest swordsman in the demon world, he could not block the duo's combined attack timely. The battle between their pure power and tactics, rather than the clash of their sins, was fought dozens of times in an instant. And finally, the battle was over. Ammon pierced the king's shoulders, and at the same time, its green flames that arose at that moment burned his shoulders and arms at once. Obviously, Yongho's attack was a fatal blow. However, he felt ominous. Rather than striking again, he released Ammon from his hand and got him back into the flames of the Red Lotus. He then immediately restrained the Queen of Fury, who tried to attack the King of Lust in succession. He hugged her from behind quickly and increased his distance from the king. Yongho's intuition was accurate. The flesh of the King of Lust suddenly exploded. Yongho defended himself and the Queen of Fury by devouring the explosion and shock with the power of gluttony that he hastily triggered. Chapter 254. Fierce Battle 4. The King of Lust blinked his eyes with a blank expression, but only briefly. The king realized what had happened before his eyes. He was just an ordinary master before he became the King of Lust. He had power as a demon king. It was not the flesh of the king of lust that exploded. The moment the explosion occurred, his body turned into smoke and scattered in the air. The smoke that quickly moved away, carried by the fast wind, was reconstructed at a distant place. It was beyond the army of gluttony, which was at the exact opposite of where he was until a moment ago. The reconstructed king of lust looked at Yong-ho and the queen of fury for a while, then turned into smoke again. He disappeared as if he had no regrets at all about the fierce battle until now. The king of lust fled, abandoning the forces of the gluttony. His escape was not incomprehensible, given the fact that he found it hard to deal with Yong-ho and the queen of fury at the same time. But Yong-ho didn't think so simple. Why was there only the king of lust on this battlefield? The king of pride was not here, nor were the 3 other directors of the dungeon market. Were they all attacking the tribesmen of the 8 clans? If that was the case, their attack was unreasonable. It was so inefficient. It would have been much more efficient if they had attacked the Queen of Fury altogether. Yong-ho thought about the situation from the viewpoint of the King of Pride. What if the purpose of the King of Pride was not to annihilate the Queen of Fury or the 8 clans? Did he want anything more? What was it? What could the King of Pride value more? Would it have a greater value than the Queen of Fury, who possessed not only the sin as well as the godly energy? Yong-ho turned his head to the west. He looked farther away than the west area, where the main stronghold of the 8 clans was located. Then he suddenly realized something. The one who had risen to the king's position, even without one of the 7 deadly sins. The strongest dragon in the demon world, with a powerful dragon army. The king of violence. It was because of him, not anybody else. Yong-ho felt confused. He suddenly came to recall the king of violence, but he could not be sure whether his guesswork was right. So, he sorted out his thoughts quickly by reconstructing all the information he obtained until now. First of all, he thought about those that he learned through Samael. First, the dungeon market was taken over by the king of pride. Second, the territories of the kings that had been managed by the 3 directors, Orobas, Abrasax, and Bifrons, were wholly possessed by the king of pride, but the territory managed by Samael was not absorbed by the king of pride completely, and it was reasonable to assume that Citrus section was not absorbed. Third, as the king of pride acquired the dungeon market, he could use the distribution network of the dungeon market freely. And this kind of distribution network made it possible for the king to conduct a blitzkrieg operation. Kings were naturally wary of the movement of other kings' troops within their territories. For example, they installed the so-called invisible sky barrier, intended to check outside in and out of their airspace, or sometimes they attacked or intercepted them. However, the kings were not wary of the dungeon market. The dungeon market created several high-speed means of transportation within the territories of the kings. So, the kings didn't care about the dungeon market using their airspace to move their items fast. It was a trust they built over 1,000 years. In some respects, they just forgot it for a long time. So much so that the dungeon market was considered as natural as water or air in the demon world. Of course, the kings did not completely trust the dungeon market. Although they tolerated the distribution channels of the dungeon market, they didn't allow the dungeon market to take control of the most important points in their territories. But Samael said that there was a secret distribution channel for the secret transactions between the kings and the 5 directors of the dungeon market, and that sometimes the secret distribution networks led to the important points because of their secrecy. The king of pride ambushed all the territories of the queen of fury, including the temple of the 8 clans, by using the secret distribution channel. Ophelia said the surprise attack was very effective, but the king of pride would not be able to mount the same ambush again because he virtually revealed the drastic change of the dungeon market to the whole demon world by making such a large-scale attack with the help of the spirits of the dungeon market and its secret distribution networks. Samael said that the king of pride must have attacked the king of envy on the day when there was a revolt in the dungeon market. If the king of pride attacked the king of envy, as Samael predicted, it was more likely that he carried out the attack on a small scale more secretly and that he could have hidden it from others because he had been prepared for it for a long time. On the surface, the king of pride was still at war with the king of envy. It was clear that the king of pride used this kind of deception trick to hide the change of the dungeon market from outsiders until he ambushed the queen of fury. If he had to ambush the queen, This would be his only chance. That was correct. Only now could he attack the queen without any prior notice. After today, it would be impossible for him to mount a surprise attack, because the king of violence, who noticed the coup at the dungeon market, would obviously destroy or seal the distribution networks of the dungeon market in his territory. Besides, the Dragon Corps on standby along the eastern borders would also move. In that case, an all-out war pattern would be inevitable. The King of Pride would have to wage a full-scale war with the King of Violence. Blitzkrieg. The three directors of the dungeon market lost Citri and Samael. The King of Pride now discovered that Citri was the Queen of Sloth. He also knew that the King of Gluttony was killed. The only enemies confronting the King of Pride were three, namely, the King of Violence, the Queen of Sloth, and the Queen of Fury. Given that Citri, the Queen of Sloth, was in charge of the southern part, she would throw her weight behind the King of Violence if the King of Pride would wage a full-scale war with the King of Violence. Yong-ho seemed to put together the puzzles in his mind correctly. According to the logic of the King of Pride, he would have the King of Lust beat the Queen of Fury. Then, he would dispatch Orobas and the elite forces of the dungeon market to strike the major dungeons of the Queen of Fury. After that, the King of Pride himself would lead his elite forces to attack the Queen of Fury in person. Most of the Dragon Corps were on standby along the eastern borders, not near the King of Violence's hideout at the far west end of his territory. Moreover, the territory of the King of Violence was maintained by Abrasax until now. Since Abrasax was the first to have come under the command of the King Pride, he could have built a secret passage without the King of Violence knowing it. This was just Yong-ho's assumption, of course, but there was a real possibility that could happen. He imagined the situation where the King of Pride carried out all of these plans. In that case, he would have to face a truly terrifying situation. Under that scenario, there would be only one, namely the Queen of Sloth, who could confront the King of Pride. All the King of Pride could do was to absorb the groups that lost their central figure, namely their king, one by one over time, and the process of him taking over their remnants would be much easier than a full-scale all-out war. That was the completion of the domino in the demon world that Samael feared. Of course, the reality was different. Yong-ho himself, the King of Greed, existed. He saved the Queen of Fury from the King of Lust, and saved Samael and Citri as well. He was not sure how much the Queen's forces were damaged by Orobas' surprise attack, but no matter how severe it had been, he would not have devastated them. In other words, the Queen of Fury and her forces were largely left intact. If the King of Pride really ambushed the King of Violence, at least there was one premise, namely, the King of Pride should be stronger than the King of Violence, and he should be able to defeat the King of Violence by a surprise attack. Could he? Yong-ho closed his eyes tightly. There was a dearth of information about it after all. He kept making too many assumptions. Maybe he made the wrong assumption from the beginning. What if the King of Envy was not killed yet? What if the King of Pride was really fighting rather than pretending to fight the King of Envy? What if the King of Pride defeated the King of Envy, but the latter is now in recuperation after suffering a major injury? At this point, Yong-ho stopped thinking. It didn't make sense for him to think more about it. He thought a lot about it in a surprisingly short time, but his conclusion was simple. All he had to do was to check it by himself. He faced the reality again, and he felt something wriggling in his arms. Please. A woman's sweet voice was added to her sweet smell. He heard it again from his chest. He quickly released his hands and let go of the Queen of Fury. After trying to forget her sweet smell on his arms, he said while stepping back, "Sorry." Chapter 255. Fierce Battle 5. In fact, Yong-ho had been hugging her all along while he was absorbed into thinking about the King of Violence. Probably, he would have been embarrassed and made a big fuss over what was happening before his eyes if he had just got here in the demon world for the first time. But he acted with composure this time. It's okay, I felt good. Oh, it's nothing. So, just forget it. Said the Queen of Fury. She cleared her throat in embarrassment. Yong-ho quickly rummaged through his magic pocket and pulled out a cloak he used to wear usually. While she was looking at him in confusion, he gently wrapped his cloak around her. As a matter of fact, Her short and thin clothes were literally messy because of her fighting. Her attire was in tatters because her arms and legs were covered with blood during the fight. Rather than clearing her throat, she bit her lips slightly. She then grasped the hem of the cloak that he wrapped around her and shook her head hard as if she was trying to come to her senses. Although the King of Lust fled, the battle wasn't over yet. Moreover, she had to do some other urgent things since she had taken care of the most urgent task. I guess I've got a lot to discuss with you, but I would like to. After blurring at the end of her words, she corrected her posture and said, I would like to express gratitude to you formally. Thanks for saving me. If you had not come, I would have been in big trouble. Yong-ho, who was afraid she might blame him for hiding the fact that he was the king of greed, felt relaxed before he knew it. The queen's smile was pure and bright, so much so that he was embarrassed by her pure gratitude. You're welcome. I am just sorry for hiding the fact that I am the king of greed. Yong-ho also responded honestly. The Queen of Fury knitted her eyebrows and asked, Did you also defeat the King of Gluttony? That's right. The Queen of Fury was never stupid. The godly energy she exchanged with him proved everything. The master of the House of Mammon was the King of Greed. He defeated the King of Gluttony and saved the Queen of Fury. Although it was an exchange, she handed the godly energy of fury to him without hesitation. It was only when the godly energy paired with the sin of its corresponding sin that anybody could exercise the true power of the king. Not only the Queen of Fury, but also Yong-ho realized it keenly. Yong-ho felt a big difference in power while he was confronting the King of Gluttony, the first king Yong-ho encountered, and the King of Lust, who he defeated this time. The King of Gluttony was dealt a big blow because his subordinate spirits were annihilated, but he was still powerful in terms of the number of horns and combat skills. But Yong-ho really felt the impact of the king's power was powerful when he possessed the godly energy of fury that he had exchanged with her. The Queen of Fury wiped her left hand, not equipped with the godly energy of fury, on her thigh instead of the cloak, and reached out to Yong-ho. You lied to me a bit, but I still want to trust you. Can I believe that our alliance against the King of Pride and the northern region will continue? Actually, that was what Yong-ho wanted. He grabbed her little hand, then shook hands with her. Then a smile was back on her face. It was so beautiful that he wanted to keep looking at it, but now was not the time to be complacent like this. Given that there was no such problem with getting connected to his subordinate spirits who had been dispatched to save the tribesmen of the 8 clans, it seemed they were safe. But he had to inform the queen that many places, including the temple, were attacked. He also had to take into account the possibility that the King of Violence might be in danger. Dhritarashtra, I have something important to tell you. While looking down at his hand, the Queen of Fury raised her head. At that moment, several men called them in a hurry. Your Majesty, we're in big trouble, Master Yong-ho. Not only Kirtimuka, but also Catalina and Kaiwan were rushing toward them. The Battle of the Red Demons, who were well known as a combat race in the demon world, was special. They did not use luxurious and dazzling magic or superpower like other strongmen in the demon world. They have fought with their physical strength since they were born. They smashed the enemy with their clenched fists and destroyed the enemy with a sharp and strong blow. Because of this, the fight among the Red Demons was a pure physical fight. Their fierce fighting, which could not be more violent, could be called the essence of violence. The area near the entrance of the Temple of the 8 Clans was completely ruined, with no traces at all. It was the result of the 2 monsters' clash, whose physical power outdid the dragons. Namely, Gusion and Orobas were engaged in deadly fighting. Orobas was destroyed. All of his 6 horns he was so proud of were broken, and his left arm was torn off. The bones of his body were crushed to pieces. Gusion, whose body was covered with blood, let out a rough breath. He opened his fists stained with his own blood and Orobas and placed them on his chest. He took Orobas' essence and kept it. After taking a deep breath, Gusion moved his right hand again instead of his immobile left arm and pulled out the elixir from the pouch on his waist. It was a precious item that he had kept at Mammon's treasure storage, but now was not the time to spare it. When he gulped down 1 bottle at once, he felt his physical strength and mana recovered. He stretched out his left hand, which began to move again, and closed Orobas' eyes, who were killed with his eyes open. There was no end to the journey to martial arts, and there was no limit to the honing of martial arts skills. Orobas missed it. He was obsessed with strengthening his body by increasing mana, but he was defeated by Gusion, who continued to improve his skills and pursued martial art for 1,000 years. Gusion, who raised himself completely, wiped the blood off his face. As a subordinate spirit, he knew Yong-ho was safe. Although he was not sure how the fight on the Eastern Front was going on, it seemed that there was no situation he was concerned about. If he could have his way, Gusion wanted to run to the Eastern Front right away, but it was unreasonable. They already reached the limit of daily use of the Door of Space. Besides, Gusion had some other work to do. What about other places? Gusion asked someone behind his back. Although he didn't rely on his superb ability to gather intelligence, he could find Ophelia's whereabouts through his keen sense that he sharpened while fighting Orobas. Looking at Orobas' body blankly at a distance, Ophelia came to her senses suddenly and approached Gusion. We have secured the Temple of the 8 Clans. We could recapture it thanks to the great fighting of the king of the Asura clan and the king of the Dragon clan. It was crucial that you defeated Orobas. Although they were the kings of their own clans, they were no more than the head of their own clan. Some of them were specialized in battles, such as King Asura and King Yaksha, but others were not related to battles, such as King Maharaga. If Gusion had not defeated Orobas, they would have been annihilated. Ophelia flapped her tail as if she was resembling Catalina. Gusion kept asking, setting his dislocated bones. What about the damage on our side? No one was killed. That means some of our soldiers were wounded. Give me a list of the wounded later. Let me give them a harder training. Cracking a joke like that, Gusion again let out a long sigh. Thanks to the efficacy of elixir, he felt like he already recovered his stamina a lot. Is there any dungeon being attacked at the moment? Yes, there are several dungeons under attack right now. Gardimundi is collecting the relevant intelligence now. Because of what happened 1,000 years ago, Gusion was reluctant to trust outsiders like Gardimundi. However, Yong-ho made an alliance with the Queen of Fury, and he ordered Gusion to protect the Queen's dungeons. So, he faithfully followed Yong-ho's order, the King of Greed, the King of Pride. Although there were many generations before his family, Gusion still hated that name. Looking north, he roared once again, then turned. He egged on Ophelia, who said she saw something strange to find out the dungeons that needed his support. The King of Lust sat down on the floor, clutching his chest. It wasn't just because he was injured while fighting Yong-ho and the Queen of Fury. His subordinate spirit just died. It was none other than Orobas, who he made his subordinate spirit only 2 days ago. His plan went wrong. Something unexpected happened. The King of Greed was back. Moreover, he had the sin of gluttony and the godly energy, in addition to the magic spear of the Red Lotus. He was not Mammon, but he looked like Mammon. Aemon in the hands of the new King of Greed proved that he was Mammon's true successor. Maybe Aemon wasn't the only one who survived. At first glance, he felt like he saw Skathak on the battlefield. It was probably one of Mammon's 12 spirits that defeated Orobas. The King of Lust raised his head. Sitting in a bush far from the battlefield, he looked southwest. As if he was overwhelmed by the sense of guilt and regret that weighed heavily on his mind, he called out his lover's name, Belial. He had no time. The dragon call must have moved by now. He was not sure what kind of trick the King of Greed who returned might use against him. So he had to fight it out as soon as possible. The King of Lust turned into smoke again. Then he headed north, wishing the King of Pride victory. Chapter 256. Clash between King of Violence and King of Pride. Chwiryong was depressed for the past several days. She was very happy when Sister Skathak made a pinky promise that she would sleep with her at night, but something wrong happened after that. Everyone was serious. Master Yong-ho was also serious. So was Sister Kaiwan. Even Sister Catalina, who looked so cute when she flapped her tail like Baduk, was also serious. Old butler Eligos, who was always nice and kind to her, didn't say anything with his lips tightened, so she didn't dare to ask him what happened. The situation did not improve, even after Yong-ho brought a woman with wings and a very pretty sister to the house. She thought everything would be okay until tonight, but the situation was still the same. Skathak was busy taking care of the winged sister and the very pretty sister all night long. In Uria's eyes, it seemed that Skathak completely forgot her promise to sleep together. Uria was upset, but there was nothing she could do because something really important happened. Yuria squatted down in the yard of Skathak's mansion and looked up at the artificial sun. Her back hurt because she dug up potatoes with Skull all day long. The dragon soldiers also complained that their back hurt all the time, but she didn't know the reason. Nonetheless, she was happy when she thought she could make delicious French fries with the potatoes. 2 nights had passed since the winged sister and the very pretty sister came here. Master Yong-ho and some others hurriedly went downstairs in droves but didn't come up. It looked like they went out of the dungeon. What happened? Did something bad happen? Whining. When the baby dungeon meerkat called her, Yuria stopped looking up at the sky and turned her head to the baby meerkat. The meerkat, who was sitting almost like Yuria did, handed out the chicken voucher to her with both hands. It was crumpled all over because she carried it in her arms, which was as large as her body. Upon closer look, it was a voucher for the master's fried chicken that was very valuable even inside the dungeon of the Mammon family. "Are you giving it to me?" Whining. The meerkat quickly nodded. It seemed like she wanted to cheer Yuria up with the voucher. Watching them, Baduk swallowed, even though the voucher belonged to Yuria. Yuria giggled, then hugged the meerkat. She pressed down the voucher before opening and lifting it high. "I hope our master can come quickly, as well as our sisters. Isn't it better for us to enjoy the fried chicken together?" While whining, Baduk answered ahead of the meerkat. Right at that moment, there was a big noise inside the mansion. Yuria suddenly got up and looked inside the mansion through the window. The baby meerkat climbed and stood upright and found out what happened inside the mansion with her unique ability to observe something. The winged sister got up from the bed and shouted something. Grandma Eustia, dressed in a black dress, who the meerkat was not familiar with, was also looking at the same place like the winged sister. Yuria and the dungeon meerkat rolled their eyes at the same time. They saw a very pretty old sister sleeping quietly in the blue water in the middle of the mansion. The blue water was split automatically. The winged sister, Samael, raised her voice again. Sitri responded to her call and woke up from a deep sleep. Typically, dragons were rarely conscious of the concept we. As the descendants of the Dragon King, they could exist alone, so they were often indifferent to their own race as well as to the world. In that respect, each of them could be called a lazy individualist. The dragon army under the King of Violence was a quite mysterious group from a dragon's point of view. It was strange that they formed the army, but it was even more strange that its members were from different clans. The dragon army was led by the giant dragon Ankabloza, called the Farthest Watcher. As a blue dragon, she was positioned with her forces along the eastern border at the order of the King of Violence. Her primary duty was to keep the King of Gluttony in check. Ankabloza sensed the movement of the King of Gluttony's forces during the night. However, she did not move recklessly because her duty was to keep them at bay rather than striking them first. It had been a while since the forces of the King of Gluttony moved. By now, they must have already confronted the forces of the Queen of Fury. Ankabloza finally spread her wings and stood up. But she didn't head north where the fight was going on. Rather, she looked to the west, where there was no fighting whatsoever. She received no order from the King of Violence. She didn't receive any new message from him either. However, she looked west for a while. Feeling ominous enough, she activated the communication magic. There was no response. No, it didn't work at all. As if there was something interfering with the communication, the magic that was transmitting to the west broke down suddenly. She did not delay any more. After ordering the flying monsters to stand by, who consisted of the majority of the dragon army, she soared into the sky, accompanied by her close aides. Something unusual happened. Otherwise, there was no reason for the communication to fail like this. She hastily flapped her wings, hoping her gloomy foreboding would not be true. The distribution channels of the dungeon market were connected everywhere in the demon world. Compared to other areas, however, there was only a small number of distribution channels in the territory of the King of Violence in the west of the demon world. Dragons were less dependent on the dungeon market than other masters of the demon world. They liked to command several races living in their territory rather than buying them from the dungeon market. Since the number of their distribution channels was small, they had fewer options. Abrasax chose the distribution channel closest to the King of Violence's hideout place called Rare. The moment the King of Gluttony's army attacked the forces of the Queen of Fury, the door of space at the end of the distribution channel opened. It was the door of space that Abrasax had prepared to use just one time for the attack today. A lump of blue mana spread out through the gap of the split air. Led by Abrasax, quite a number of his men arrived in the land of the King of Violence. The time during which the door of space was open was very short. At best, it was only a minute or two. Moreover, the door of space was more than a few kilometers away from the King of Violence's rear. However, the moment the door of space was closed, Abrasax realized that he was spotted. He was caught opening the door of space in the territory of the King of Violence. Abrasax hastily opened his arms. Without any delay, he freely released an enormous mana from the 7 horns on his head. During the surprise attack this time, Abrasax had only one mission, namely, he was supposed to scatter mana in the air to isolate the King of Violence by interfering with all kinds of communication magic and space-moving magic. When the tremendous mana was released, the forest filled with trees shook violently. Abrasax clenched his teeth, but his mana didn't pay off. The forest didn't shake because of Abrasax's mana. Some other movements were taking place throughout the forest. Not content with erecting his 6 horns, Bifrons turned into a giant spider, his original body. He rolled his 8 eyes to grasp the surroundings and sensed the vibrations of the ground with his 8 feet. Dragons with huge bodies rarely created underground dungeons like demon kings. They built their dwellings in open basins or high mountains where they could fly at any time. Therefore, the dragon's dungeons were not limited to the rare, like the King of Violence. The entire estates around it could be called their own dwellings. However, the size of their dwellings was usually hundreds of meters in diameter around the rare. Even the dwellings of the ancient dragons who lived for a long time didn't exceed 1 kilometer in diameter. But the King of Violence's dwelling was an exception. Bifrons shuddered with fear. If he had been in the form of a humanoid, not a spider obviously, cold sweat would have broken out on his back. They were already inside the rear of the King of Violence. The entire forest was the dungeon of the King of Violence. Even the 5 directors of the dungeon market were not aware of this fact, something so embarrassing to them. The reason why the entire forest shook violently was because the subordinate spirits of the King of Violence started to move their operation. As soon as the door of the dungeon was opened, numerous spirits with powerful mana poured out in succession. It was natural that they responded to the opponent's hostile attack. There were many clans who were living under the protection of the King of Violence. Bifrons sensed through the vibration of the ground that thousands of spirits were moving toward him. His 8 eyes spotted flying monsters rushing toward him from all directions. While Abrasax's duty was to obstruct the movement of the King of Violence's forces interfering, Bifron's mission was to command his troops. Although the enemies were larger than he expected and their response was quick, Abrasax and Bifrons came into the King of Violence's territory with a war with him in mind. From the beginning, most of the spirits who accompanied the two were magic summoners. Prodded by the two, they hurriedly completed the formations of their summoning targets. When the 36 summoners recited the spell at once, a pile of bright light was formed in the red sky, and a new light spread from the pile of light. In no time, in the blink of an eye, several giant formations of spirits in the shape of light were drawn in the air. Chapter 257. Clash between King of Violence and King of Pride. 3 zombie dragons and 4 bone dragons stuck their heads out at the same time. Each of them was a giant monster who was dozens of meters tall. After that, flying spirits appeared in a row following 7 undead dragons. Griffon and Pegasus, carrying the warriors of the alien world, soared into the sky, and the beasts that did not carry the monsters screamed wildly. Their summons did not happen only in the air. Brainwashed elf spirits summoned all kinds of spirits, and the Elder Lich raised up golems. Vampire lords summoned the undead spirits such as skeletons and zombies. Dozens of groups quickly swelled into thousands now. The majestic posture of the 7 undead dragons that filled the sky was terrific. Watching them, Abrasax smiled a pleasant smile again. Bifrons also regained confidence again. There was also movement on the part of the King of Violence. The forces that shook the entire forest finally appeared. Drakes and wyverns, called the dragon subspecies, covered the sky. They numbered at least 100. Dark elves armed with magic bows and spirit magic became united with the forest and surrounded the forces of the dungeon market. The dragon soldiers escorted them, and mountain giants and other giants stuck their heads out over the bushes. Suddenly, heavily armed dwarves and orcs were on standby at major crossroads. Dragons were also mixed with them. They were the young men of the Red Dragon clan who inherited the blood of the King of Violence. The largest ones among them were only about 20 meters tall, because they hadn't fully grown yet, but they numbered more than 20. Only a few minutes had passed since the door of space opened. Nevertheless, there was already a war looming in the surrounding area. It seemed like a huge battle would begin anytime soon. But the war didn't start yet, because the most important person didn't yet appear. Someone was crouching down in the dragon rear over there. He rose to the position of a king by using his power only when he had nothing like the 7 deadly sins. The atmosphere was torn hard with a roaring sound like an explosion. It took place right after the great being soared into the sky. Even though he was a few kilometers away, his presence seemed to fill the whole sky. The ground turned black under the red sky because of a huge shadow. The scene of a creature several times as large as a fully grown ancient dragon, with its body over 200 meters long soaring above the sky, was very unrealistic. Once again, the atmosphere shook violently. The wind caused by just flapping his wings once made the whole forest howl. The King of Violence was flying over his forces on the ground, red and huge being who looked like a god. All of them on the ground couldn't help but be overwhelmed by his magnificent grandeur. It took tremendous courage for them to dare to face the King of Great Dragons overlooking the ground. The King of Violence looked down at the army of the dungeon market. He did not warn them. He opened his mouth to those who were overwhelmed by his presence. Then he exercised the power of the great Dragon King. Dragon breath light colored the world. It looked like the whole world was shaking. The power of the greatest dragon traversed the space, crushing everything in front of it. One bone dragon that was exposed to dragon breath was smashed even before he could avoid it or block it. A huge line was drawn on the surface, and all the beings within that huge line disappeared. The remains of the smashed bone dragon fell on the ground. There were quite a few vibrations, but no one looked back. Abrasax couldn't breathe properly. The dragon breath passed by only a dozen meters away from him. What would have happened if that strong power had hit him? He would have stopped it. He would have protected himself somehow, because he was called the strongest mana of the dungeon market. But he could not immediately imagine himself defending himself against such an attack. The King of Violence's mighty images stopped him from even imagining it. Abrasax finally realized that he was the King of Violence. He was a being that had to be called that way. The King of Violence, who claimed to be an observer, never went out of his territory. His battle against the former King of Gluttony over 200 years ago was his last battle in the history of the demon world. Perhaps that was why Abrasax ignored that fact. Abrasax breathed with an effort. 1 second was like an eternity to him. This land was the dungeon of the King of Violence. All the masters of the demon world showed their strongest power when they were within their own dungeons. Maybe they made the wrong choice. Maybe they should have never touched the opponent from the beginning. Abrasax momentarily thought so, but in no time he regained his reason. By generating mana, he shook off the feelings of overwhelming fear that paralyzed his thinking. The King of Violence's dragon breath missed him. Someone twisted that terrifying force in front of him. That was why the dragon breath drew a diagonal line on the surface. That guy twisted the trajectory of dragon breath with the power of envy, which was in the shape of black smoke. An enormous mana swirled from the godly energy of envy in the form of a ring. The owner of the godly energy let down the godly energy of pride in the form of a longsword. The King of Pride smiled feebly, then looked at the King of Violence with the 3-eyed telescope on his head. This was the first time he actually faced the King of Violence. However, the moment he encountered the Dragon King, he could find out lots of things. The King of Violence was not surprised to see the King of Pride handling the godly energy of envy. The King of Violence had something more important in his mouth, which was his own voice. The voice of the King of Violence, which could be called thunderous, echoed from heaven down to earth. It was a voice that seemed to resonate directly from his head. King of Pride, or the Royal Family of Pride. It was a weird title. A smile close to a big laughter was on the King of Pride's face, who asked without any hesitation, His voice was so small compared to that of the King of Violence, but everybody could hear it. "Did you know about it? I was suspicious of you, and now I have become convinced." Abrasax could not understand what they were talking about, but Bifrons understood it intuitively. He looked at the King of Pride before he knew it. Unlike the other kings, the King of Pride inherited the sin of pride to form a royal family. What if he didn't form a royal family? What if he was just one of the kings? Such a possibility didn't exist. Bifrons had met the former King of Pride. He was different from the current King of Pride. He was a completely different person. But the King of Pride did not deny what the King of Violence said. He took control of the godly energy of envy and that of pride at the same time. The black smoke and pure white light, the result of his intense emotions, engulfed the King of Pride. The power of sin was the power of the soul. Thousands of years weighed upon the power of both sins. The King of Violence did not ask about his situation. He soared high and prepared dragon breath for the second time. The King of Pride raised his head high. He released the mana from his body that he had completed as the best possible one over 1,000 years. Shaking off all his doubts, Bifrons ordered his subordinate spirits to attack the King of Violence. 6 undead dragons flew at the same time, and the forces of the dungeon market launched an attack against the forces of the King of Violence. They clashed in the sky and on the ground at the same time. The war between the King of Violence and the King of Pride finally began. No one knew who was the first who possessed the 7 deadly sins. It was unclear when the spirit of the demon god was divided, or when the divided soul was conceptualized as the 7 deadly sins. Perhaps the first person who possessed the 7 deadly sins did not know that he had them. But there was a man. He was not convinced that he was the first who possessed the sin of pride. However, it was clear that he was the first who had been called the King of Pride by the majority of men, the first King of Pride, Belial, the demon king of Rule. The royal family of the King of Pride began with him. The King of Violence soared into the sky. 4 of Bifrons' 8 eyes turned to the sky. He quickly moved his fingers to control the undead dragons. Although one of them was killed, there were still 6 left. The way the 6 undead dragons, who were dozens of meters long, flew at the same time was enough to cause fear among the forces on the ground. But Bifrons couldn't feel relaxed. Those on the ground who looked up to the sky shuddered at the terrifying posture of the King of Violence, who seemed to press down the 6 dragons with his giant body covering the sky. The giant body of the King of Violence was 200 meters long. The distance between the ends of his full wings was even longer than the length of his entire body, so much so that he could easily wrap all the 6 undead dragons soaring toward the sky under his wings. Zombie dragons, under the command of the King of Pride, let out their own breath toward the King of Violence all at once. Bone dragons flew higher, as if they were trying to make a suicidal attack. Chapter 258. Clash between King of Violence and King of Pride. 3. The zombie dragon's breath, surging up toward the King of Violence, took on lots of forms. Looking down at them, the King of Violence released mana, which alone brought about a strong resistance. The breath targeting the king was distorted or sent off in the wrong direction that they had originally targeted. What the King of Violence used was called secret dragon magic that had been passed down only among dragons. 3 types of breath containing light, flames, and lightning scattered everywhere, dazzling the eyes of those looking at them. 3 bone dragons that discerned the scattering fragments of the breath attacked the King of Violence at the same time. Each of the bone dragons was dozens of meters long, but the King of Violence was several times as large as them. It was like a child attacking an adult. The King of Violence rotated his body in the air. Then, his huge and long tail, 1/3 of his long body, showed a terrifying movement. It struck one of the bone dragons after tearing the atmosphere. It was a tragedy. The bone dragon plunged to the ground faster than he soared. At the moment he crashed on the ground, the fragments of his broken body also poured down like a meteor. Zombie dragons stumbled because of the torrent of the atmosphere created by the King of Violence's tail attack, which could be called the strongest strike ever. One of the bone dragons that escaped his tail attack bit the king's neck. Another dragon struck the king with its tail as violently as possible, as if he was imitating the king. At that moment, Bifrons felt hopeless, watching them fighting the king. The bone dragon's teeth could not penetrate the king's red scales. Despite an attack by another dragon backed by its massive weight, the king of violence did not move. The king of violence bit one of the bone dragons. Even though he was already an undead, the dragon screamed. The sharp, powerful teeth of the king of violence crushed the bones of the bone dragon to pieces. The energy of death exploded at that moment. It was the power Bifrons created by making the bone dragon explode when he was bitten by the king of violence. An intense energy of death engulfed the king of violence, but it was again useless. The energy of death that tried to curse the king could not penetrate his might. When the bone dragon exploded, its bone fragments bounced off and messed up the king's mouth, but that was it. When the king of violence again used the dragon's secret magic, his damaged mouth was restored to its original condition. Bifrons gave up the hand-to-hand fight. The zombie dragons and one remaining bone dragon dispersed. Those bone dragons that crashed on the ground shuddered, unable to stand up again. 4 undead dragons wandered around the king of violence and fired magic and breath. Instead of dealing with them one by one, the king of violence flapped his wings once again. In an instant, he raised his altitude more than a few hundred meters high. He then opened his mouth wide toward the ground. He let out dragon breath for the second time. The king of violence's breath was like a huge pillar of light. The undead dragons flapped their wings desperately, screaming. Dragon breath penetrated through them and headed for the ground. The original target of the king of violence was not the undead dragons. It was Bifrons who commanded them all on the ground. Looking up at the disaster pouring out from the sky, Bifrons kept swallowing. He didn't close his eyes to the end, and a miracle happened at that moment. Dragon breath was distorted. Pitch black smoke, a symbol of an intense emotion, distorted the trajectory of dragon breath again. Light covered the ground. Dragon breath, which penetrated the ground, exploded, eliminating the surrounding area. A powerful earthquake shook the entire forest. However, Bifrons survived. Gasping for breath, he looked at the sky. The king of Pre, the owner of the black smoke, was standing in the air alone. Those who were in the realm of the power he created were not swept away by the explosion of dragon breath because of the black smoke from the godly energy of envy that neutralized the explosion. The king of pride no longer looked up at the king of violence. He took off into the sky. The broad wings spread behind his back made the king of pride soar high in the sky with just a flap of his wings. The king of violence hurriedly raised his head and looked up at the king of pride, who was now rising over his head. The king of pride looked down upon him now. At that moment, the king of violence triggered powerful magic. The scorching heat that the king of violence brought about with his determination struck the king of pride, but the black smoke of envy surrounding the king stopped the heat. At the same time, the powerful gravitational magic of the king of pride pressed down on the king of violence. The king of violence flapped his wings. His strong will broke the gravity magic. Although he lowered his altitude slightly, he never plunged to the ground. 4 undead dragons charged at the king of violence again. The king of pride lifted the godly energy of pride. Once again, the light and their roaring noise shook the sky. Like all the lords of the demon world, the first king of pride had one power, the demon king of domination, the power of domination. He could freely dominate those who inherited his blood and his subordinate spirits. Not only their bodies, but also their souls, belonged to the king of pride. Time passed. The king of pride, who used everything around him as a tool, could not avoid death. The king did not properly remember what happened at that time. He couldn't tell whether it was his will or just the instinct of the living that he didn't want to die. Maybe none of them was true. When the king of pride became aware of himself again, it was all over. The king of pride looked down on his body only when he was old, weak, and eventually died. The king of pride ruled his successor. He robbed the successor's body, not content with ruling him. Then he swallowed up the successor's soul. The 7 deadly sins were to dwell in the soul, not the body. Although he acquired a new body in the successor, he was still the king of pride. The king of pride lived that way. For him, his descendants were no longer the heirs who could inherit everything he possessed. His successor was just a tool to be taken away by the King of Pride. The King of Pride was independent. Those who did not know the situation thought that the sin of pride would be inherited through generations through his bloodline. They called it the royal family of the King of Pride. Time passed again. One day, the King of Pride met the person. The person lived in eternity, like the King of Pride. If the eternal life of the King of Pride was based on his power, his or her eternal life was based on sin. The person was freed from time because he could be anybody, old or young, man or woman, a woman with the sin of lust, the king of lust, Asmodeus. The war did not take place only in the sky. A deadly fight was going on in the entire forest. Although it was the battle between the two giant kings, their subordinate spirits were actively engaged in the battle, helping their masters. They had a role to play on their own. The army of the dungeon market aimed at the King of Violence's hideout, Rare, but the King of Violence's subordinate spirits tried to block their efforts. Their individual attack was obviously weak. But what if 100 spirits cast their magic at the same time? What if 100 healers heal the King of Violence? What if the huge flying weapons attack the undead dragons and the King of Pride? The forces of the King of Violence aimed at Bifrons and Abrasax. At the same time, they defended their masters, Rare. They wanted to help their master, roaming in the sky. While the fight in the sky was magnificent, the fight on the ground was desperate. Thousands of troops on both sides fought for their own lives. Dark Elf Yurtiga shot a magic arrow. He was an excellent sharpshooter. As if to prove his excellent competence, the magic arrow accurately hit the target. The vampire woman who controlled ghouls grabbed the magic arrow stuck in her neck and screamed. White smoke soared from the wounds on her neck. The ghouls went around even more violently. Yurtiga was about to hurriedly shoot his second arrow, when a rock as big as a house falling from the sky struck the tree on which Yurtiga was sitting. The huge earth spirits controlled by brainwashed elves were responsible for the attack. Yurtiga rolled on the ground, and the dragon soldiers, the defending warriors of the Rare, ran over him. Armed with magic weapons, they chopped up the ghouls and rushed toward the brainwashed elves. Orc warrior Urs axe cut the neck of a griffon who fell on the ground. The alien warrior who was lying on top of the griffin hurriedly moved his hand and stabbed Ur's chest with a spear. Collapsed with a scream, and the orc warriors behind swung their axes on the alien warrior's head. Blood splattered with a cruel hitting sound. Drakes breathed out fire from their mouths. The alien warriors aboard Pegasus and Griffin cut drakes and wyverns while crisscrossing the flames raining down on them from all directions. The young red dragons expressed their anger. Although they were not good at magic because they hadn't grown up fully, they were still dragons. They were already born with the weapon of a strong body. The red dragon's flames were much more powerful than Drake's fire. The alien warriors who were blocking the flames with their magic shields were burned, and the red dragons struck them hard with their tails. Chapter 259, Clash between King of Violence and King of Pride. However, they were not invincible. Huge steel golems grabbed the tails of the young red dragon, who were in the thick of slaughtering the alien warriors in succession. Using their mighty power, the golems smashed the young dragons on the ground and trampled on their necks. The elder liches killed the weakened dragons using powerful curse magic. Some of them resurrected young dragons who were just killed as the undead. It was a fierce battle. Both the forces of the King of Violence and the dungeon market were attackers as well as defenders. The war situation was so tight that neither side had the upper hand, but time was on the side of the forces of the King of Violence. Abrasax, who interfered with various communications and the magic of space, felt nervous. He could sense it because he was covering the entire surrounding forest with his own magic. Somebody was coming toward him from a distance. They were not the dragon core located in the east. They were dragons nesting not far from the rear of the King of Violence. They also had eyes. The battle between the King of Violence and the King of Pride in the sky was so spectacular and dazzling enough to be noticed from tens of kilometers away. The storm of lightning swept the sky and the ground at the same time. A zombie dragon, who could not withstand the magic torrent, fell to the ground, and Bifrons cursed in dizziness. It was not because there were only 3 undead dragons left. The King of Violence's huge body in the sky suddenly headed to the ground. He flew down faster than a falling zombie dragon. Landing in the middle of the dungeon market's forces, He caused an earthquake due to the impact of his landing. And that wasn't the end. The King of Violence rotated his body. His tail, which struck down the bone dragon, swept the ground. Although the way they lived was different, they were two men living in eternity. They were naturally attracted to each other, and they shared a long time together. The King of Lust, who was identified as a woman, loved the King of Pride. The King of Pride doled on his new tool, namely the King of Lust. Time had passed again. 7 kings with the 7 deadly sins ruled in the demon world. The King of Pride ruled as the king of the northern area. He was clearly different from the King of Lust, who changed his identity every now and then, building his own forces and secluding himself from the real world. Because of this, only the King of Pride formed a royal family, although they lived in life. Therefore, they were two people living for eternity the same way, but only the King of Pride formed a royal family. The King of Pride was a superior being, just like the King of Lust became the best swordsman in the demon world. The King of Pride had so many experiences and skills over a long period of time. All the people said that the royal family of the King of Pride was the best among the 7 kings. But that was it. Just because he was the King of Pride, he could not easily subdue other kings. Actually, he was not powerful enough to overcome the combined attack of other kings. But the King of Pride was satisfied with it. Even if he alone couldn't overpower the 2 kings, he was the best demon king. Even those kings who were in rivalry with the King of Pride admitted it. There was no other king in the demon world who was above the King of Pride. Then one day, the man appeared. He was the man who realized anything without any problem that the King of Pride only imagined. He was the man who defeated the Queen of Fury and the King of Gluttony, took their sins, and unified the southern area of the demon world, Mammon, the King of Greed. The King of Pride could not recognize his presence. It seemed as if the world was splitting apart. The army of the dungeon market felt like a huge cliff was being thrust against them. By twisting his body only once, the King of Violence broke the ranks of the dungeon market's troops. The King of Violence didn't stop there, and flapped his wings using the power of rotation. The scene of his huge body flying in beautiful curves caused another surreal horror. The King of Violence bit the zombie dragon's neck. He thrust the dragon struggling with his limbs into the ground violently, then burned the surface of the earth with flames. The ground where the dragon fell melted immediately. His bones and skin were stuck to the ground. The forces of the dungeon market, who were near the dragon, turned into a handful of ashes. The King of Violence repeatedly soared into the sky, then headed toward the ground. He was fast and agile like a feline beast. He stopped the breath of the zombie dragons with his secret dragon magic. This time, he crushed the head of one of the 2 remaining dragons with his hand, then blasted out the wave rather than the flames, disrupting the flying of the last zombie dragon. When he was caught in the wave, the dragon struggled in the air before falling back to the ground. Once again, his fall caused great shock and vibration on the ground. After defeating all the zombie dragons, the King of Violence kept vigilant against the sky. The King of Pride, who was still standing alone in the sky as if he didn't want to get involved in the fighting on the ground, swung his hand slightly toward the King of Violence. Suddenly, the sky was split, and a burning meteorite emerged through the clouds. The disaster of the sky, which came to this world, enchanted by the King of Pride's power, was divided into numerous fragments and turned into a rain of fire. The burning fragments turned everything on the ground into hell. Regardless of the force of the King of Violence and the army of the dungeon market, the King of Violence once again flapped his wings. After crushing the head of a zombie dragon in his hand, he activated telekinetic power by releasing mana. After using the body of the zombie dragon like a shield, he soared over the King of Pride. The King of Pride laughed. This time, he fidgeted with his left hand. A bolt of huge lightning struck from a completely different angle from the meteorite, and it hit the zombie dragon hard. The skin of the dragon, tattered by the rain of fire, was smashed at once, and the King of Violence flew through the remains of the dragon. He opened his huge mouth toward the King of Pride and released dragon breath for the 3rd time. He was now close to the King of Pride. Moreover, dragon breath this time was so strong that it was hard to even compare it to the previous 2 breaths. That was why the King of Pride didn't avoid it this time. He swung the godly energy of pride in his right hand. The blade of light soared above the sword-shaped blade of the godly energy of pride. As long as dozens of meters long, it split the dragon breath squarely. Now dragon breath was split into two. Split by the godly energy of pride, it pierced the sky. Then the scattered fragments got mixed with the rain of fire, and it faded. The pillar of light completely disappeared. The king of violence, who had exhausted his mighty power at once, stumbled for a moment, and the king of pride swung his left hand, wearing the godly energy of envy, violently. Then, the black smoke that was surrounding the king quickly formed the shape of a giant. He struck the king of violence by wielding an axe made of black smoke. For the first time since the fight began, the king of violence moaned in pain. His giant red body shook momentarily, and the black smoke scattered, losing the shape of a giant. Then, it penetrated into the body of the king of violence and exploded. But the king of pride also felt it hard to confront the king of violence. But he didn't fail to smile. A sense of great satisfaction surging deep inside his heart made him pleasant. Mammon, the king of greed, the man who died over 1,000 years ago, the man who was now gone. He insulted the king of pride a lot. He first reached out, suggesting they join hands to stop the invasion of the celestial world. He sincerely moved to save the demon world, and acted as if he was the king of the whole demon world. However, the king of pride could not defeat Mammon. The king of lust described Mammon, the king of greed, as something like a miracle. The king of envy was jealous of Mammon more than he was jealous of the king of pride. So, he betrayed Mammon. In fact, he had Mammon pay the price suitable for him. He pushed Mammon, who was running wild like the king of the demon world, into the threshold of death. But the king of lust was fiercely opposed to this. He begged the king of pride to change his plan to close the door of the celestial world by joining hands with the only 3 remaining kings after Mammon's death, arguing it was too risky. But the king of pride made up his mind. He wanted to see Mammon's fall. He wanted to see Mammon giving up the celestial door to survive while struggling after he was betrayed. The sin of pride craved for it. At the end of the day, however, the king of lust eventually followed the king of pride's decision. The king of envy got even more enthusiastic about the king of pride's decision. And when his last minute finally came, Mammon humiliated the king of pride more than ever. He remained alone and shut the door of the celestial world. Professing he was the lofty king of the demon world until the end, he saved the demon world from the attack of the celestial world. The king of lust suffered from a great sense of guilt, while the king of envy was delighted, saying they got the best results. However, the king of pride fell into a pit from which he could never escape. Chapter 260, Clash between King of Violence and King of Pride. 5. Although the king of pride devastated the house of Mammon and its labyrinth of greed, he couldn't feel happy at all. It was just meaningless for him to trample on the Mammon family without Mammon. He had to surpass Mammon. He thought he had only one way to overcome Mammon, who was already dead, no matter how hard he pondered over it. The royal family of the king of pride had changed since the day Mammon, the king of greed, died. The king of pride, or the sin of pride, was not satisfied with simply acquiring a new body. Like the king of lust said, Mammon was something like a miracle. It was a monster, born by sheer coincidence. The king of pride wanted to recreate the monster. Just like farmers improved their crops and hunters worked hard to raise hounds and falcons suitable for hunting, he continued to improve his descendants. To the king of pride, who valued only himself, his descendants were nothing more than tools that he would throw away after using them. He badly treated those who inherited his blood as if they were a dog or a pig, focusing solely on creating beings with a stronger DNA. As a result, the generations of his descendants changed so quickly over a long period of time. People thought the number of the previous kings of pride who ruled the northern area over the past 1,000 years was around 5 at most. But it was not true. There were hundreds of experimental beings during the intervening years of the former king of pride that Bifron said he saw directly, and the current king of pride. And he finally created a superb being that surpassed Mammon's qualities and potential, which could be called a perfect fit for the king. The king of pride faced the reality now. While the king of violence was falling down, He was staring at the King of Pride squarely. Looking down at the King of Violence, he tightened his arm, holding the godly energy of pride. The sin of pride dwelled in his soul. The power of the Demon King also dwelled in his soul. The King of Pride could rule the soul as well as the body of his descendants. Because of this, he always had two powers. He kept picking various forms of power until he finally chose the best one. The Demon King of Magic. Its power was simple, clear, and best. All the 7 horns that sprouted on the king's head disappeared. He cultivated the power over 1,000 years, to which the power of the King of Envy was added now. Thus, his power was now sublimated into that of a god. 8 horns of light sprouted on his head instantly. Besides, 6 wings of light spread behind the back of the King of Pride. A huge halo formed over his head. It was truly powerful, like a god's power. So, the King of Pride was convinced that he was equal to Mammon of yesteryear. Rather, he surpassed Mammon and became the strongest being in the history of the demon world. The King of Pride looked at the King of Violence's eyes, hoping that his huge eyes would be filled with fear and despair. He stabbed into the air with the godly energy of pride. Then a sword of light, whose length would exceed 100 meters, was formed in the air. A giant in the shape of a black smoke grasped the sword of light, and it threw the King of Violence on the ground after piercing him with the sword. Now, this was his plan of action. First, he would kill the King of Violence and take away his godly energy of greed, as well as the dragon heart of this monster who was the most powerful dragon in the history of the demon world. Then he would kill all the remaining kings and take away their sins, so he can put together all the 7 godly energies as well as the 7 deadly sins, except for the sin of greed. Finally, he would rise to the throne of the true demon god. After that, he would close the door of the celestial world that showed signs of reopening, or he would fling it open and subdue the celestial world with the power of the demon god. If his action plan were realized, he would surpass Mammon beyond comparison. All of Mammon's achievements would look trifling compared with the true demon god's great achievements. The King of Violence, who was thrown on the ground, saw the King of Pride indulging in daydreaming like that. He made up his mind at the moment he, who had remained only as an observer of the demon world for a long time, witnessed the enormous mana being released by the King of Pride's 8 horns and his madness. My subordinate spirits, fight with me until the end. His voice reached all the forces under his command. It was the king's order, and they had no power to reject his order. The King of Violence became a tyrant for the first time since he ascended to the throne and squeezed out the power of his subordinates. This land was the dungeon of the King of Violence. But the king's forces confronting their opponents under the command of the King of Pride collapsed helplessly. Those who fell to the ground were not just the races of dark elf or orcs. Dragon soldiers and other dungeon warriors who were empowered by the King of Violence also collapsed, let alone the descendants of the King of Violence who were fighting in the sky. The power of the dungeon was united together. After swallowing the power of all the spirits of the dungeon, the power was delivered to the King of Violence, the owner of the dungeon. The King of Pride felt that power, too. The King of Violence laughed fiercely. He soared in the sky, ignoring the sword of light that pierced the middle of his back. The sword of light split his body and caused tremendous pain, but he ignored it. The King of Violence flapped his wings. The King of Pride hastily pressed down the King of Violence with a gravitational field. But the King of Violence did not stop attacking. He triggered the vortex of mana and disrupted the gravitational field. With the red sky being stained with blood, the 2 kings narrowed their distance. The King of Pride swung the godly energy of pride again. A huge sword of light pierced the King of Violence, but he didn't reject it. Hitting against the sword of light with his chest, he further narrowed his distance with the King of Pride. The power of envy wrapped the King of Pride and became a black giant. But the King of Violence immediately rushed and chewed it hard. His target was only one from the beginning. Bifrons also realized it. He deactivated the mana with which he was controlling the forces of the dungeon market. Then, he hastily laid a barrier to protect himself. Abrasax did the same thing. He could not afford to stay fearful of the dragon army now. He withdrew all the mana directed toward the sky. The teeth of the King of Violence had cut the black giant. The king of pride again swung the godly energy of pride inside the black giant. The sword of light pierced the heart of the king of violence. The king of violence no longer delayed. He could easily narrow the distance with the king of pride and bite the black giant's neck, the strongest red dragon ever. The power of all the dungeon spirits concentrated on the king of violence. All of this exploded at once. It turned into one light and covered the whole world. The commander of the Dragon Corps, Ankabloza, called the farthest watcher, stopped flapping his wings because she sensed something unusual. Although it was taking place far away, she could see what was happening. The king of violence's last order was delivered to her. Instead of heading west, she headed east again. The king's order was as follows: gather all the dragon armies scattered all over my territory and look for the king of greed. Then help him block the worst demon god, because only the king of greed can save the demon world again. Ankablosa showed no tears. Like a strong dragon, she thought of revenge. She headed east at full speed. The Queen of Fury, who was crying over the tragedy that happened at the Temple of the Eight Clans while she was absent, turned her head before she knew it. She began to shed tears again, although her eyes were swollen because of her crying too much. She could not know the reason exactly, but her heart ached a lot. She grabbed her chest. Citri finally recovered and stood up, supported by Samael. The king of violence was her contractor. That was why she could learn what had happened to the king of violence. She saw how the king of violence was killed during his last moment. He left behind a mental message for her. She clenched her teeth and made up her mind like the king of violence did. The king of violence's hideout was now gone. His vast dungeon disappeared without leaving behind a handful of ashes. It was as if the god who created the world took away part of the western area. The short time that the king of violence needed to narrow his distance with the king of pride, during that short span of time, the king conveyed his last order to the Dragon Corps and a mental message for Citri. It was the land that determined the fate of the demon world 1,000 years ago. It was the land where Citri, the queen of sloth, stood beside the king of greed until his last moment. It was the land where the grave of Mammon, the great king of greed, was located, which only Citri and the king of violence knew. The godly energy of greed located there like a tombstone wriggled. The godly energy of greed, which the king of violence had placed there in honor of Mammon, soared into the air. It was the last secret weapon of the king of violence. The godly energy of greed soared into the air and raced toward its other half.